Okay, now let's come to our keynote, which is will talk about Ukrainian refugees, distorted perspectives, and competing post-colonialism. We have two speakers who will give us their presentations one after the other, and then we will have enough time for discussing, for asking questions, and maybe also for bringing in some perspectives of the Ukraine panels, which we already had this morning, and where we already started quite engaged discussion. So let me shortly introduce the speakers to you. The first speaker will be Dr. Viktoria Sereda, who is currently a senior fellow of the Forum of Transregional Studies in Berlin. She is a senior researcher at the Institute of Ethnology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and she is professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. After studying in Lviv, Budapest, and Edinburgh, and obtaining her doctorate in 2006, she did a lot of scientific positions and was recently a research fellow at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, where she used sociological data to develop a digital atlas of social changes in Ukrainian society, including cross-regional mobility and internal displacement after 2014. I'm a human geographer, and that sounds really fascinating to me. So you really have to tell me more about this project. And yeah, she is author of plenty publications, researched profoundly on Ukrainian mobility, migration, and forced migration. And I'm really happy that she is our first speaker. And Viktoria, I invite you to come and give your speech. And after your speech, I will invite to you the second speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm really emotionally touched and moved for the possibility to talk about what is happening in Ukraine now. As a scholar, I need to reveal my positionality and why I'm doing and studying these issues and how I approach them. So I should start from 2014, when the escalation of violence and armored fights broke over Donbass. My colleagues from Donetsk, with whom I had a very long-term research relationships and friendships, had to leave their homes and to move somewhere with their families. They came to my city, Lviv, and my family, many of my colleagues, tried to help and accommodate them. Because this process of resettlement was quite painful. There were, as you see on your screen, at this moment, close to 2 million people on move, and the state was not in a shape really helping them or offering aid. So, and as a sociologist, of course, we could not avoid talking about it and reflecting on it. And we realized that this is what is happening is absolutely new for our country, and we have to study it. And since that time, I changed my focus of my research, however, staying more or less in the bounds of my previous research interests, and I was studying IDPs since that. And last autumn, I came to Jena to finish my book on this research. And as soon as I finished it and submitted a manuscript at the end of January, the whole country started to live lives as I described them in the book. So the second reason for me was the invisibility of internally displaced people and issues for European migration research and media discourse. First wave of displacement was contained mostly within the country. And by 2016, Ukraine had the largest number of IDPs in Europe, 5th largest in the world, by European media and academia continued debates about the refugee crisis in their own countries, totally overlooking the Ukrainian case. Some, like Poland and Hungary, tried to manipulate the situation, claiming that they accepted those close to 1 million refugees from Ukraine, who in reality were legal or at this moment irregular labor migrants who did not come to seek protection and never applied for refugee status. But they were doing it to avoid receiving Syrian refugees. During 2014-16, the hot phase of the conflict in EU, we had close to 2,000 refugee applications, and depending on the country, between 2 and 4% was the success rate. So situation gradually changed since 2017 visa-free regime, and the evolution of my research is driven by necessity to represent the phenomenon in its complexity, to give voice to as many sites and groups with different experiences and possibilities. The third reason is decolonization of the research we are talking so much these days. The critical approaches to studying societies under authoritarian regimes or war-torn countries voice the necessity for more empirically and ethically grounded approach to production of knowledge, as it is these approaches which feed into both policy-oriented problem-solving discourses and media discourses. So to know what to do with the conflict or to offer certain policies, we have to have a knowledge about it. But it very much depends how we label it and how we understand what knowledge we produce about this. And Billing points our attention to the prevalence of actors from the global north in shaping the conflict resolution mediation efforts in Eurocentric land, in assembling of the conflict expertise. And this is very much case with Ukraine as well. As a result, knowledge produced by local experts on the periphery is often viewed by Western academia or peace-building practitioners as less objective and less authoritarian. This results in privileging Western over local knowledge. Also, Ukraine does not belong to the global South. Its locally produced knowledge is often treated with the same attitudes. As a Ukrainian female scholar, my research were often treated with suspicion, and when I try to provide a more nuanced, multifaceted description of the conflict in Eastern Ukraine and the IDP situation in response, the oversimplified mainstream interpretation of the nature of the Donbas conflict, which was quite often identified like identity war on polarized identities and memory projects. For this reason, whenever I try to raise my voice, quite often I had first start any conference from saying, no, I'm not Ukrainian nationalist. I'm just trying to give some nuances and bring some knowledge about the region and what is happening there. So this is the third reason why I'm here and why I want to talk a little bit about the issue. So on your screen is exactly mapped the trajectories of resettlement of those people who were displaced after the annexation of Crimea and beginning of the conflict over the Donbas. And as you may see, the majority of them settled along the conflict zone borders. For example, in Mariupol city, which was recently destroyed, over 25% of its population were made by IDPs. So people who were fleeing from the conflict, who lost absolutely everything, and in majority of cases, those who had not enough resources to move further to other parts of the country, settled there. And the next map, which is a little bit below in blue colors, I mapped the percentage of people who claimed during the 2015 and 17 that they've been helping to IDPs. So what we observed that this was not regionally aimed outbreak of the help, but actually the whole country was helping its IDPs, specifically because state was failing to do so for quite a long time. For some reason, what's happening after the February 2022? If you look at the map on the top, this is the map where the military activities were happening mostly. And if you remember the previous one, you would understand that exactly those the most vulnerable and where the majority of displaced who already lost everything and didn't have enough resources, these regions were hit. In addition to that, if you look at the green map, this map showing the percentage of urbanized population in the country. So these are the regions with the highest level of urbanization, and they were under attack, which created the big and very rapid influx of people both within the country and outside of the country. And you have numbers on your screen, you probably know them. That's close to 12 million were affected. And the last map is a map showing the people which we surveyed in Poland, Germany, and Ireland and asked where they are coming from. And here you can see that actually those parts where the majority of IDPs were produced less refugees outside of the country. And this could be also the reason because people didn't have enough resources to move quickly enough. And finally, I just want to say a few words about the specific features of Ukrainian displacement. Some of them you probably already know, that these are mostly females with kids. But what is important to keep in mind, that first of all, these are double or triple displacement. So people were already displaced, and as I showed you, and now they have to move. And or quite often they go in stages from the most dangerous places to the nearest, and people from that places move to the next, to the center and to the west. So people are not really using the state programs. If you look at the percentage or number of people who officially registered as IDPs in Ukraine, it's only around 1 million. So civil society is the most important helping hand and aid relief body within the country. And this is exactly because of this double and triple displacements and how people are using resources to move further. Another important issue is changing roles. When within one family we can have internally displaced, when people bring their families closer to the safer places. But for example, elderly are not able to move, or men, not all men can move abroad. So they stay in a safer place, and then women go with kids across the border, or for example, go with some elderly and kids across the border, leave elderly and kids there, and then they might be commuting back and forth. So when we talk about IDPs, refugees, we have to remember that these are changing roles. And another important issue is that what we see, these are people very actively civically. So according to our survey within the country, 25% of IDPs, those who were fleeing from the war, actually were also helping IDPs. So you are fleeing, but you're also helping others. And approximately the same numbers we see in Germany about the civic activism involvement. And finally, we have to, because again, we have this discourse of Ukrainians as a white group, Christians welcomed and accepted in Europe because of this. But in reality, we have an enormous big number of ethnic and religious diversity. We have Muslim communities in Ukraine, we have Roma, we have Jewish communities and many others who are moving together. And we also have a group of political dissidents from post-Soviet space who lived for quite a long time in Ukraine. And all these groups are now moving outside of the country, and we have to keep it in mind when we are discussing refugee flows from Ukraine. And I will stop here.
Okay, so thank you for the first part of this keynote. We will switch to the second keynote speaker, who is already standing here waiting to start. This is Franck Düvell. He's a senior researcher at Osnabrück University. He was previously also head of the migration department at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. He has, for a couple of years, or for many years actually, he had been a professor at the Center on Migration Policy and Society of the University of Oxford. He does a lot of work for consultancy work, like for example, for the ICMPD or for the IOM, GIZ, EU Council and so on. And he studied specifically countries on the periphery of Europe in the wider neighborhood of the EU, and he has specific connections to Ukraine. Yeah, I cannot imagine a more perfect speaker pairing with Viktoria than you can be, Franck. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Birgit. Thanks for your kind words, kind introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I will now pick up from where Viktoria left and discuss some of the discourses on the war of Russia in Ukraine, and then wrap up by making some fundamental conclusions on the field. But a few words on me, and this is only a snapshot. I have been researching matters to do with Ukrainian migration since 2006. At the very beginning, I think I was the only Western researcher ever in the country studying migrants and refugees in Ukraine. People were amazed, "Oh, what do you do here?" I actually then also started running an NGO in Ukraine, the Border Monitoring Project Ukraine, to specifically look at human rights of the so-called transit migrants, refugees, students, ethnic minorities. I have family in Ukraine. My in-laws are from and still in Ukraine. I was in Ukraine when the war broke out, and I joined the track of the first 10,000s of people leaving the country, literally walking towards the border with pushchair and baby and luggage. Felt incredibly privileged because I knew from the very beginning I was just going back home, whilst all the others, millions of people, were leaving home behind. But this is also why I'm a bit emotional about the whole matter. At the beginning of displacement, there was fierce criticism voiced that during the evacuation, which was incredibly well organized, Black people were, for example, prevented from boarding trains or leaving the country, and thus racially discriminated. And I agree, there is a point. But nevertheless, it was not taken into account at that point that there was a war, that resources were scarce, and that people had to be prioritized. And prioritized at that time were women with children, the elderly, the handicapped. But those migrants were mostly young men, students. And at that time, men were already generally prohibited from leaving the country because of the general mobilization. So the women were prioritized and the others had to stay behind. And I felt already the first 2-3 days that certain actors jumped at a very quick conclusion, not adequately considering the intersectionalities at stake. Another argument that was made was that there was some preferential treatment of Ukrainians in Europe, which is racist because they are white and blue-eyed and Christian. And this was on the backdrop, of course, of ongoing racially motivated pushbacks, specifically of Muslims at the external borders of the EU, Poland, Lithuania, Greece, Italy, and whatnot. However, whilst again, there is a point, this is still ignorant, and we've just heard that, of the diversity of the Ukrainian people, where we also have Muslims and Roma and black-haired people and dark-eyed people, all of it. And So it was ignorant of the diversity of the Ukrainian people. And also, what I had not heard previously was any such skepticism with regard to Turkey's welcoming of Syrians as Muslim brothers and sisters. And it occurs to me that there has been a case of some double standards. In the same vein, I read that the Temporary Protection Directive in response to the war in Ukraine is a form of preferential treatment. Again, whilst there is a point, few people seem to acknowledge that temporary protection, by definition, is a fairly precarious status that is based on a political agreement and can be easily withdrawn anytime, whereas a full refugee status comes with the same rights, but is permanent, is based on the rule of law, and is much more secure, actually. So apart from sparing people from the lengthy asylum applications and granting quick access to work, which they can't realize because they don't know the language, they have to do integration courses, and they have childcare commitments. It's not actually that generous, this temporary protection status. And people since also complain, let's not only talk about Ukrainians, let's not forget about Palestine, Afghanistan, Israeli rockets on Gaza, etc. And I was pretty annoyed that neither at the Imiskui nor the Metropolis conferences, Ukrainian displacement played any prominent role at all. It was rather sidelined, if not completely ignored. And I'm glad that this conference is different and properly addresses this disaster. And what Viktoria has just shown is that very few people, if any, had at least previously, and I meant since the events in 2014, talked about Ukraine. All interest was on these other named countries, whilst the war on Ukraine, the daily rocket attacks, the 1.5 million IDPs, the daily death were ignored. I rather believe there is almost a trend in suppressing not only the Ukrainian case. No, we also need to look at Georgia, Chechnya, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, and other countries who were ignored rather to the advantage of cases in the global south. In order to unpack these issues and think how we can explain that, I will now take a closer look at the case of Ukraine, though much of this applies to the countries I've just mentioned in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and also many provinces within the Russian Federation. First, I would argue Ukraine is not just another country in Europe. It is not simply European, like most other countries, UK, France, Germany, Spain, Netherlands, Italy, Poland. Many of these countries actually were imperial, hegemonic, colonial countries with a past in colonialism. Many are rich because of the colonial heritage, and they are comparably powerful, not at least because they are members of the European Union. In contrast, the geographic space that is now called Ukraine has for most of its history been ruled by other European empires, notably Lithuania and Poland, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsarist Empire, not to forget the German Nazis who even enslaved 2 million Ukrainians, purged at least 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews, and was then subjugated by the Soviet Union. There was an era of free Cossacks and a very short stint of independence in 1918, 1919, before the country finally only became independent in 1991, just over 30 years ago. So Ukraine may be geographically Europe, but politically it was for long rather an internal colony within Europe, very different from the other European countries. During these centuries, the country was divided by these powers, and borders were moved over Ukraine by these powerful neighbors. The territory was incorporated in one or the other country. There is the famous case of people who lived in 4 different countries: Austrian Empire, Hungary, Soviet Union and Ukraine without ever having left home, because the more borders moved across them. So Ukrainian borders have been typical colonial borders drawn by external powers, cutting across communities and even families who were then divided. The people now inhabiting Ukraine have thus been exposed to cultural, linguistic, religious, and intellectual colonization. Notably, populations were forcefully displaced, like the Tatars, or replaced as part of exchange of population policies. Poles are the most prominent example. And Russian settlers as colonizers were brought in. A genocide was committed in the 1930s by the Soviet Union, the Holodomor. The Nazis, during the Holocaust, I've mentioned that, exterminated Jews and Roma populations. At different times, Ukrainian language and culture was banned, and instead the Russian language and culture was imposed on Ukrainians. Intellectual and cultural leaders were deported or killed. Centrality of the Moscow Orthodox Patriarch Church was imposed on Ukraine. At various occasions, race played a role, notably by way of anti-Slavic racism held in the West. Even Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels mention Galicia, Northwest Ukrainian, in a pretty nasty fashion. I just posted about this this morning on Facebook. And currently, Russia enforces compulsory Russian curriculum teaching, pointedly spoken. Ukraine thus endured a very long history of forced Russification. And Ukraine is not, as we've heard, simply white and Christian. In fact, Snyder shows that historically, Ukraine was simultaneously a center, a major center of Muslims and Jews and Christian traditions. 130 ethnic minorities registered in the country, 10 million people, this is a quarter of the population. Different languages are spoken, different religions. There are also Ukrainian minorities in the neighboring countries because of the colonial moving of borders. There is diasporas of resulting from forced migration of Ukrainians in Canada, the US, Brazil, and elsewhere, accounting to 10 million people. So the very idea that despite this diversity, there is something like a Ukrainian nation is, as Snyder suggests, rooted in the solidarity of the people based on this common history and experience of long-term colonial ruling. And from that perspective, Ukraine, to me, appears to be an anti-colonial product. The colonial history, I shall say, of Ukrainians is full of violence and violations of the rights and integrity and very existence of Ukrainians. Indeed, the violence currently wielded by the Russian invaders against civilians, torture, rape, mass killing, concentration camps, terror bombing, is all rather reminiscent of the brutalities of colonial warfare. And it's not surprising that the people inhabiting Ukrainian territories adopted a cooperative approach and have been fighting anti-colonial or libertarian struggles, such as the uprisings against the Ottomans, resistance against feudalism, the emergence of the Free Cossacks, the 1948 uprisings against the Red Army in the 1920s, partisan fighting, very famous against the Nazi occupation, the pro-European revolutions of 2004 and 2014, and now the resistance against Russian occupation. And this is also why we now see a wave of de-Russification, a form of decolonization and the version of what Mbembe calls the liberation of the mind. Currently, we see that Ukrainian voice has often been overridden by the Russian discourse wanting to make the world believe that Ukrainians are a kind of minor, inferior Russians. Ukrainians are the subalterns of Russia and that Ukraine is an independent state is an error, or if they object, then a kind of Nazis, and thereby they are dehumanized. And in many parts of the world, unfortunately, Africa, Asia, South America, the Russian narrative seems dominant, even though the people there themselves endured European colonialism. This is a mystery to me. And last but not least, Europe was inclined to sacrifice Ukraine and other countries in the region, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, for the sake of their own economic and political interest. So humanism, democracy, universalism were almost deaf and blind vis-a-vis Ukraine, notably since 2014. And it was maybe only because of the diplomacy of the Eastern EU member states, driven by their own troubled memories of Russian and Soviet occupation and ruling in the East, that saved the Ukrainian people from being sacrificed. And all these aspects, and this is why I sketch this here: occupation, foreign domination, superiority claimed by the rulers, race, dehumanization, violence, slavery, genocide, and a general necropolitical trend, imposed borders, lies, liberation movements, etc., resonate well with post-colonial thinking. And therefore, we need to consider four things. First, Russia as a colonial power. Second, the position of Ukraine within the European and global imperial order. Third, post-colonial thinking with regards to the region east of the EU. And fourth, how to bring in the Ukrainian voice and thereby also the perspective from below. And this means first we need to acknowledge Russia's imperial and colonial past, presence, notably in the Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia, the Baltics, not at least to mention the invasion of Afghanistan in '78, interventions in Georgia, in Moldova, the bombing campaign in Syria from 2015, which contributed a great deal to the displacement in Syria. Second, we need to acknowledge and conceptualize that Ukrainians and other people in the region were treated as colonial subjects, although they are white. This is not entirely new. Think of the Jewish people, Roma, or the Irish, but still it seems to be an epistemological challenge. And third, accordingly, I'm challenging the simple and simplifying binary of the global North and the global South, and instead promote adding the notion of the global East, as Müller suggests, to this. And this is my main ambition, actually. I was getting very nervous yesterday when we had the other keynote, which sort of referred very strongly on the global North, global South. And where was the East? It didn't exist. It wasn't there. The global East is less so, and I'm coming to the end of my talk, is less so a geographic concept, but rather an epistemological concept that shall facilitate understanding the actions of subaltern empires like Russia. This is a concept I borrow from Morozov. It is simultaneously a part of the global imperial core, but also the Western periphery. And I want to be cautiously provocative and argue that some post-colonial thinking has been blind, notoriously blind, on the global East and on Russia as a colonizer. Some post-colonial thinkers, like Mbembe, perceive Europe almost like a homogeneous bloc and do not know about or ignore the internal colonial hierarchies. And some actors may have even fallen to the Russian colonial narrative, which played out its subaltern role, as Morozov puts it, by pointing to the American imperialism in order to distract from their own imperialism. However, I insist that the subaltern imperial power Russia is no less vicious than the dominant power, America. I wonder about some double standards, such as pointing fingers to some but not to other actors. And indeed, De Souza, a South American, Brazilian, I think, scholar, identifies certain Marxist anti-colonialists still full of patronizing determinism, power thinking, centralism, and etatism, and calls for decolonizing some versions of post-colonial thinking. I've also been frustrated for too long of the lack of migration research interest in the Global East, wonder why that is, and would call for more research in the field. And finally, last thought, I wonder whether there is some competition between emphasizing matters in the Global South vis-a-vis matters in the Global East, and call for leaving this behind and include the Global East in how we think about the world's structure and inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And I invite Viktoria to come to us. So here is the first question or the first comment on this double talk we had.
Yes, thank you very much for those very interesting talks. I have maybe a very simple question of understanding for Viktoria. When you showed, where people fled in 2014, and then also later on, you said that they were lacking the resources to. Some people were lacking the resources to move on further, right? And I found this a bit surprising, and I'd like to ask you to explain this a bit more, because normally we think, okay, people need resources to cross borders irregularly, and what kind of resources would you need to move to a different part of Ukraine compared to kind of a district closer to Crimea, for instance? So just to better understand this point.
So one important resource would be job market. And Ukraine has a very different job market structure, because over there, the majority of population were working either within mining industries or other types of industries. And center and west had almost nothing to provide, which means it's not only you have to relocate, but you have to change your profile. And it requires more resources and more time. So in this case, it was critically to be closer to those possible job markets and places. Plus, again, in many cases, elderly or those who were, sick and could not move would stay on the territories, occupied territories. And then you have to take care of them, bringing, medicine or visit them or help them with something. So you cannot allow yourself to go further. The third moment was that housing was not provided. So you had to rent housing, and prices would immediately went up, which meant after the more or less ceasefire, in some cases, people would even go and stay in their previous houses, but work on government-controlled territories, and they would be commuting back and forth, because at least in this case, they save on rents. And all of this created a situation when those who had enough resources to move further, they would move further, but those not. There were some other reasons for Crimean Tatars, but I'm talking about those moving from the Donbass.
Okay, thank you very much. That really helps to understand. Now, also, if I may have a short, more kind of policy-related question for Franck. I share many of the concerns you said about, this talk about two classes of refugees and so on in a very simplified way. Now, we're having a situation where, in my reading, as a result also of this activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, we have a very unequal kind of concentration of Ukrainian refugees also in Europe. And what we are seeing in the German context at the moment is that the reception system is really under stress. It's kind of mayors and lots of towns saying they don't know how to handle the situation anymore. We all are, of course, very careful and should be critical if political actors try to outplay different groups of migrants or refugees against each other, as you also criticized in the beginning. But I'm absolutely, or at the moment, really observing this exactly this thing by some political actors, from the opposition. I mean, also including CDU.
Yes, and we have
basically saying, okay, we can't take in any more people. We have to stop more or less our humanitarian admission program from Afghanistan. We shouldn't take in people from the Mediterranean Sea as promised by the government, even if it's only a few thousand people, in this EU solidarity mechanism. And also what we are seeing, okay, there's a small increase of people moving from on the Balkan route at the moment, and we have a very strong political reaction of people, I mean, including our in the minister saying that we really need to control the borders a lot better for kind of other migrants, right? How would you comment this? Was it a mistake, or was it naive to have this free choice model for Ukrainians?
But shall I respond? Yes. There are three issues. First of all, the matters behind the current conflict are a bit more complex in that we have forthcoming financial negotiations between the Bundesländer and the central government, where the Länder are increasing pressure on the central government to be provided with more funds. So they are verbally in their discourse constructing a crisis. We are reaching capacity level. People will be sleeping on the streets and in gyms in order to sort of argue for more fund. And they are kind of exploiting and in a very sort of irresponsible way, building an argument against the central government. This is the one sort of situation I see behind the controversy. The other is that just like in 2014-15, just like in January, February this year, just like now, the government, the Chancellor's Office, Foreign Office, Ministry for Interior fail to monitor the global displacement situation, prepare for that, prepare for the local authorities for the influx of some people. So they just don't tell the local authorities what's going to come, even though information is publicly available. And short-sighted as they are, it is completely forgotten that the numbers which are rising at the moment only rise because we had virtually no refugee migration for 2 years during the pandemic, and people got stuck in Turkey, in Greece, on the Balkans. And most of the people arriving through the Balkans now are not those who have recently left Syria. It's half of them are coming from Greece, or they got stuck in the Balkan countries. So what is sort of constructed in the discourse as another rise of numbers and framed with questions, will we get another 2015, is just a little short-lived spike, which will reduce again. And there is a danger, I agree with that, that one group is played out against the other, which is why it is important to understand sort of the global picture and sort of tell media and public what is really going on, compare and demonstrate that there is absolutely no cause for any panic. The levels we now have are 10–15% of what we had in 2015. So any claim that 2015 could be repeated is irresponsible, is politically driven, and need to be countered, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I will walk over to Friederike, who observes the chat and who will tell us what questions are given from the chat to you.
Yeah, so we have a lot of people who thank you for your talks. And I have a question from Petra Dankova to Viktoria. And she writes, what you said about local expert not being recognized as authoritative resonates well with my experience from the Czech Republic. At the same time, now I see a worrying trend in Germany that everyone from Ukraine, regardless of their expertise, is forced to talk on the issue of Ukrainian refugees. I worry that this mirrors another dynamics that have been criticized by decolonial thinkers, that people outside of the West can only speak on their own region and on topics predetermined by the West. What would be your sense of this dynamic?
Yes, of course, and this is the dilemma, and this is the issue, ambivalence, and I don't think it's right to say that only locals. And then the big question is actually, who are the locals? And there is also a lot of discussions that we cannot construct locals as a one single voice. So we need to have many voices. We need to understand intersectionality of different groups, which might have different experiences, different interests, and give a possibility to those groups to voice their experiences or to tell about their issues and problems. So in this case, we should not just grab someone and say, ha, he is from Ukraine now. Yes, we have to understand, and this is true about any other refugee groups. I just was at the conference, and there was the same about Iranian migration, that we have talking heads, and in many cases, these are the male refugees with scholars who are talking about everybody, but forgetting to tell many different stories and many different experiences because of the different nationalities present, ethnicities, different religious cultures and gender issues and many others. So in this case, it's very important to have this diverse voice present and not only, again, constructing some Ukrainian voice versus Western voice.
Thank you. Then we turn back to the audience, and I saw that Oksana already raised her hand, so please, your question.
Dr. Oksana Koshulko, I have a question, a comment and a question to Franck. First of all, I would like to thank you, Franck, because I would like to say you, today I heard not actually one the best, really the best speech about Ukraine, because you explain very, very difficult processes and things by very, very simple words. So it's wonderful. Thank you very much. And my question is concerning the Russian language. Because it's very, very sensitive topic for us. Because, for example, if German people would like to speak in German, it's a normal process. If Polish, it's the same. But if Ukrainian people would like to speak in Ukrainian, today Viktoria talked about that, we are nationalists. I don't know why. So my question is, what do you think when we can change it and how to change it? Because according to my results, my scientific project in Munich, the majority of the Ukrainian refugees, unfortunately, speak in Russian. And it's very difficult sometimes to Polish or German people to understand they are Ukrainian refugees or they are Russian citizens. So it's my question. I would like, thank you very much.
Just very quick, there are so many countries in the world that are multilingual, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's Denmark, whether it's Belgium, whether it's Spain, whether it's Nigeria, Senegal. Mostly you have 2, 3, 4, 5 languages. India, I have no idea. Is it 500 languages? Is it 1,000? Nobody would ever ask this question. People should be free and allowed to speak the language they want to use at home. That's my answer to that, and it shouldn't be politicized and such an issue. In the colonial context, it's maybe a little more complicated because language has been imposed. Russians have been moved across borders as colonizers. Interestingly, the Russian speakers of Ukraine now begin speaking and learning Ukrainian, so they distance themselves from the colonial language. And this is something I have zero expertise about, but this is certainly something interesting to study. Thanks.
Thank you. We still have a little bit of time. So I look around for further questions, and I also look to Friederike if no questions in the chat. Oh yes, please wait that the microphone comes to you. Here it is.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me with the mask on. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to ask this question because maybe the answer was obvious in your speech, Professor Dvell, and I just didn't understand it. But you said that Ukraine could be an example of an anti-colonial product. And I just wanted to ask you if you could kindly explain to me again how you came to that conclusion. It was a very surprising statement for me, and I'm just not sure that I fully understood it.
Well, I was sort of addressing the question how it comes that such a diverse territory with such a diverse population, with such diverse experiences, which has been crisscrossed by migration for several hundreds of years. It was depopulated, new populations were brought in, how that could grow into a nation, and what processes were forging a nation here. And sort of building on Snyder, I felt that this principle of solidarity, having this experience of millennia of colonial ruling and violence and dehumanization and whatnot, all I listed, that created a sense of solidarity, which is the element that binds together a nation, as opposed to other imagined identities, ethnicities, whatsoever. So that was it in a nutshell.
All right, time is already used up, but let me thank you really deeply, both of you, Viktoria and Franck, for giving us this fresh insight and also like historical contextualization of the conflict, and like maybe increase ideas how we can understand this conflict. And of course, this is only the beginning of understanding it. And we still have 1.5 days to continue our discussion.